Hi, everybody. This is Adam Elenbaas from Nightlight Astrology. It's November 6th today, Tuesday. It's voting day here in the United States, so I hope everyone's getting out and voting. Today, I'm going to be doing the first of two, maybe three live talks on the entrance of Jupiter into Sagittarius. So this is a big planetary event, specifically because Jupiter takes about 1 year to travel through one sign. So in the course of astrological, research and reporting every month, we are mostly talking about big aspects happening between planets, like oftentimes the outer planets and maybe a faster moving inner planet like Venus opposing Pluto, or Venus in a square to Uranus, or something like that. But it's kind of a bigger deal in astro speak when a planet that is slower moving enters a new sign. So when in this past May, when Uranus changed signs into Taurus, it was a big deal. And the reason for this is that a planet takes 7 to 8 years to change signs. So the Uranus takes 7 to 8 years to change signs, I should say. So the event of the planet entering a new sign is a bigger deal. Same thing when Saturn changed signs into Capricorn last December. The more people paying attention to it. Jupiter is similar. Jupiter takes about 1 year to go through one sign, and so when Jupiter changes signs, it's a bigger planetary event. So let's talk about some of the basic reasons why a planet changing signs is a big deal. First of all, anytime a planet is moving slower in astrology, on some level, you could think about it representing a slower process of karma. Karma meaning action, like just action in the world, and the outcomes that are a part of the actions that we take, or the consequences of our actions. So that's a basic definition of karma. The Greeks had a word for it called praxis. So two very similar concepts. They've been around forever. The basic idea of karma is that we reap what we sow, sometimes not in ways that are fully conscious so that we fully understand, and that the entire universe is meaningfully orchestrated, that the events and outcomes of so many different choices that are being made with our free wills all the time are being sort of woven together in a meaningful tapestry, a meaningful whole. That's an idea that most astrologers, I think, probably believe in. So we are looking at, in terms of slow moving planets, when they change signs, it's like the karmic clock has been moving very slowly through a certain phase of both influences and outcomes that have been here in the material world. And once that kind of karmic clock, all the planets you could think of as like multiple different hands on a karmic clock, once they change signs, it's as though the quality and nature of time and our experiences, the quality of our consciousness, the influences we're contending with here in the material world, as well as the kinds of karmic outcomes that are destined to happen, it all shifts. And it's a big deal when the planet is shifting signs because it's so slow. So it's like, you've been, for the past year, we've been in this deep kind of Jupiter and Scorpio moment. And that's a whole year, a whole trip around the sun worth of dealing with Jupiter and Scorpio karma, action and reaction, or action and consequence. So you have to think about it like that. And then that gives you a feeling in your body as to why the change of Jupiter into a new sign is so important. So, the past year, the karmic clock has been, again, Jupiter and Scorpio, and now it's changing. So that's one big reason why we pay attention to the transition of slower moving planets moving into a new sign. Well, what to speak of all the planets, really? Any planet changing signs can be eventful, though the faster they change signs, the subtler it is in some ways, or the more dynamic and fleeting it is. I've come to notice and become very sensitive to these changes because I pay attention to them all the time. And that's one surefire way to develop sensitivity to the kind of karmic clocks. But it takes a little while. It takes a little while to sort of recognize them. So a lot of the times, it's a weird thing that the more you get interested and involved in astrology, the more you get to know and understand the language, the more real the effects of astrology become, the more that you begin to see astrology in the world around you. It's sort of similar to, and this is kind of a bad analogy, but let's just say that it would be like walking around not having any language for the weather, for rain or clouds or sunshine or wind or whatever. As you start talking to a weatherman, let's say an early shaman or something like that, they're talking about these patterns. And the more they talk about them, the more that the tribe or the group begins to recognize and respond to the environment in similar ways. Like we all kind of like, oh, it's a moody, rainy day, and like that. So these events connect us to the collective. You can start to see the influences in the world around you, and your communities, and your friendships, and your relationships within yourself, and the kind of ecology of your inner life, because you're getting to know the language and you have words and patterns to fit to the things that are recurring. Now, it's kind of a bad analogy because in some ways the rain is a lot more obvious than like a Venus transit. You know what I mean? A Venus transit is something that you have to learn how to pay attention to on a much subtler level than getting wet on your head from the rain. I was getting wet this morning standing out to vote. Okay, so, but the more you get to know the language, the more that the language becomes real in a sense, because you're able to validate what you're experiencing. And again, because this is a subtler level of experience, a kind of karmic weather language that you learn and entrain into your body, it takes a little bit longer, and it becomes, in a sense, that that subtler level of karmic reality becomes more real to you the more that you get to know it and validate your own experiences by predictable and descriptively accurate language. So at any rate, that's just something to note as a kind of a little bit of a digression here, but it's important to note that because not everybody, when they tune into an astrology forecast, will understand or be like, I don't understand it, it's over my head, or whatever, and they'll be like, or I didn't really think it was very accurate, and some of that, to be fair to astrology and astrologers, some of that is due to the fact that you have to get to know the language of karmic weather. And as you get to know it, it starts validating a subtler level of observation that you're taking in all the time. You start to become more conscious of it, in other words. And that's part of the language acquisition process in astrology that people have to go through, which is weirdly why when you start getting into astrology, it's sort of like you start feeling a little different than everyone else, because you're like, oh, I'm really into astrology. I like following astrology, and everyone else is like, oh yeah, I don't know if I believe in that or whatever. And secretly you're like, oh, it's not that you can believe in it or not. You just don't understand it yet. Once you do, then it's not even a matter of believing in anything, really. It's not like you can believe that the weatherman is talking about the rain. You know what I mean? Like nobody's like, oh, I don't believe in weathermen. But astrology, if you get to know it in time, is actually just as sort of basic and concrete in terms of what it describes in our everyday experiences as the weather. But it's describing it on a subtler level. And so subtler things, because people have a harder time tuning into subtler things, people are much easier to project their ignorance in the form of doubt. Oh, I don't know if that's real. Well, you develop an inner life, and you won't have any problem with whether or not it's real. Okay, so at any rate, that's just an aside. Jupiter entering Sagittarius is the way that you experience a slower moving planet entering a new sign is over the course of a longer period of time. You will start to notice themes that become more prolific, that grow in the terms of influences that you feel inside, in terms of the way you make choices, in terms of the thought patterns that you have, in terms of the themes that enter your relationships, that enter into the collective and the news. And you have to pay attention to it over a longer period of time. So that's one reason that we also pay attention to outer planets, because they sometimes shift something in the mood of the collective. The collective takes a little bit longer to shift, right? For example, a lot of the times a faster moving interplanetary transits, like a Venus opposite Pluto or something, will pop into the news for a couple of days in terms of like a big event in the news or something. It's like really a great example of, Venus opposite Pluto or something. But it moves so fast. It's not like you suddenly for years everything is really deeply Venus opposite Pluto, right? However, with slower moving planets, over a longer period of time, you start to notice the climate, the environment, the consciousness in the world starts to take on certain archetypal or thematic qualities. They become really pronounced. So the other thing that's kind of cool about looking at a planet like Jupiter entering Sagittarius is we're literally talking about an influence that's going to grow and sort of proliferate over a much longer period of time, and therefore appear in a much broader range of places and events and things like that. So sometimes people say, the slower moving the planet, the more fitting it is for mundane interpretation, meaning it's more fitting for looking at the zeitgeist or the mood of the people or the prolific themes or events that start happening repeatedly across a longer period of time. So Jupiter entering a new sign is interesting for that reason as well. Jupiter entering a new sign is also exciting in this case. We're going to start talking about some of the specifics because it's entering its home sign, and the dignity of a planet can change when it enters a different sign. So the dignity of a planet shifting is something I'll explain again just in a little bit, but that's a big reason why we also pay so much attention to planets changing signs, especially slower planets changing signs, because having a planet in a new dignity, meaning a specific kind of relationship with the home that it's in, the celestial home, which is the sign, and its planetary host, the so-called ruler of that sign, that can dramatically shift the way that a planet expresses itself. And that's a big part of the study of astrology for thousands of years. So those are some important factors. But one other big factor, practically speaking, in birth charts, by transit, when you're using a transit approach to forecasting, meaning you're tracking the movements of the planet as they relate to or move through the still frame of your birth chart, that means that a planet is entering, in ancient astrology where whole sign houses were used, that would mean that a planet is entering a new whole sign house. New house, new topics. Moving from the second to the third, maybe moving from money to siblings, moving from the third to the fourth, siblings to property, like that. So a whole new area of life, new topics, new concerns, new events can start taking place in dramatic fashion when an outer planet that moves very slowly shifts signs and starts, kind of really placing emphasis on new house topics. Now, if you don't use whole sign houses, that won't make as much sense. But ingresses into new signs, traditionally speaking, are a big deal because, at least among many of the ancient astrologers, probably the most popular early original form of house division was whole sign houses. And so, again, the early idea of a planet ingressing into a new sign means also moving into a new house. So that can shift things quite a bit. And this is also why, for example, this is something that you'll hear traditional astrologers say, your Saturn return sort of begins when it enters the sign of your natal Saturn and ends when it leaves the sign of your natal Saturn. And that's because, from a traditional standpoint, Saturn would be entering your the whole sign house of Saturn and there all the way until it leaves. So that's another good reason to really pay close attention to ingresses. Traditionally speaking, as long as a planet is in the same sign of any other planet in your chart, it has an effect on that planet. So you can, in terms of like a more advanced forecasting, paying attention to the movements of outer planets or slow-moving planets into new signs is also a really big deal. New aspects can be formed in the sky and in the chart, and new aspects will be formed oftentimes with emphasis on different modalities. For example, for the past year, Jupiter in a solid sign like Scorpio, of what we might call a fixed sign, also means that throughout the year, there are hard aspects from all the other planets, the faster moving planets, happening when they go through fixed signs to Jupiter. So you get this kind of, it's not just Jupiter's in a fixed sign, it's that Jupiter all year will be in relationship to kind of like fixed energy because, well, Mars is in Aquarius, right, all summer long. Jupiter is in Scorpio. So there you have this kind of, even though they're not in exact aspect by degree, they're witnessing one another by virtue of their whole signs. In ancient astrology, the most basic version of an aspect was not by degree, but by whole sign. The degree-based aspect was kind of like a slightly separate way of looking at aspectual connections, just as valid and important, but whole sign aspects were also considered. Any planet in a fixed sign is in a whole sign aspect to any planet in another fixed sign, regardless of what degrees they're at. So you also think about it just in terms of like, okay, Jupiter is moving into a double-bodied sign now, a mutable sign. It's going to start witnessing all the double-bodied or mutable signs. For a whole year, we're going to have Jupiter-Neptune in a square. You know what I mean? Even though it won't be degree-based the whole year, but all year the Jupiter-Neptune connection via square will be more pronounced. That's the kind of stuff that also shifts and creates different patterns that are much deeper and broader and more complicated than just the planet and the sign. So we look at all of these kinds of things. All right, so now that we've talked a little bit about why it's important to take a look at an outer planet, or slower moving planet changing signs, let's talk about Jupiter moving into Sagittarius. The word for ruler there in ancient astrology was, and I'm going to slaughter the pronunciation of the Greek, but oikodespotes or oikodespotes. I've heard it pronounced both ways, I guess. Someone who actually speaks Greek would probably be better at pronouncing it. But the basic idea of oikodespotes, as far as I understand it, is like it was connected to the word despot, but not in the way we think of despot, like a tyrant or something. We would think of oikodespotes as like a steward or a host. And so, for those of us who like the Game of Thrones series, for example, you'd say there's House Tyrell, or there's House Lannister, or there's House Stark, or whatever. So similarly, the signs all have this sense of being a house. The original way that signs were talked about was like in the language of house, whereas what we now think of as a house, like house 1, 2, 3, or 4, were called positions or places, and they coincided with the 12 houses of the zodiac, which were the signs, or zoidia. So they zoidia. So you have this idea of signs coinciding with places, and the signs becoming they're thought of like House Stark. So the North, in Game of Thrones, right? Or if you read Lord of the Rings, like the House of Gondor or something like that. We were joking about this in my Sunday class this week. So you have a house like that, and it has a steward, right? So the steward might be like the king of the North, or the steward of the house is basically like whoever you would go to that is in charge of that domain, that house. So when Jupiter has been for the past year in the sign of Scorpio, it has been in House Mars. You can think about it like that. Okay, Jupiter has been in House Mars. So as Jupiter has been in House Mars, it has been a guest in the domain of Mars. Now, in the ancient world, many of the different kinds of rulers that we think about were all called oikodespotes. So an exaltation ruler, or a bound or term ruler, a triplicity ruler, all different kinds of oikodespotes, and they all had slightly different roles to play in terms of what they delineated or how they played host to a planet within their sign. For example, all of the fire signs in the ancient world by day were ruled by the sun as the oikodespotes, the host, which we call the triplicity ruler, the trigon lord. Similarly, if it was a nighttime chart, all of the fire signs had a trigon lord of Jupiter. So now what does that mean? Well, Robert Schmidt said, interestingly, perhaps the best way to think about it is like, there's a local lord that rules Leo, the sun, right? But then if it was evening, there's also a larger regional lord that rules all of the fire signs, like a bigger swath of territory. And that bigger swath of territory is ruled by Jupiter in the nighttime. Whereas Leo, just the individual sign, the house lord is the sun. So you have to think about that. Plus, then there's individual degrees within every sign. First 5 degrees, or first 6 degrees of Libra, I think, is the terms or confines of Saturn. So even individual little boundaries of degrees within each sign will have an oikodespotes, a ruler or a host or a steward. Now, they all have different levels of importance, and you can track Jupiter throughout its transition through all 12 signs of the zodiac, which takes about 12 years, in terms of the sign that it's in, the triplicity lord that it's answering to, the specific bound lord that it's answering to as it travels through a sign, the face ruler that it's in within every 10-degree portions, the 3 10-degree portions of each signs. And it changes the mood and kind of internal dynamics, because there's different kinds of hosts that are relating to Jupiter more specifically for periods of time. It's all very interesting and can be very complicated, right? I personally don't recommend making it too complicated, especially when you're just learning, because you just be really overwhelming. You're just like, I'm just going to go home. This is too hard and complicated. But just so that you have an understanding that these signs were thought of like, okay, let's use the Game of Thrones analogy. You're in the north, right? You could be staying at a local fisherman's home while you're in Stark's, the Northland, right? Or you could be in Winterfell talking to, the king of the north. Do you know what I mean? Or you could be talking to some kind of regional overlord that sees to some larger regional affairs or whatever. So there in the ancient world, though, you understand that the analogy that works really well is understanding each sign to be like a large swath of cosmic territory, and there are many different hosts or stewards for those different territories. And a planet within a territory outside of its own. So Jupiter in Scorpio for the past year has not been in its own territory. It would be like if a Stark were visiting, with maybe not a Lannister, that would be a bad example, but if a Stark were visiting with a Tyrell or something, there may be a bad example. There's too many dramas in Game of Thrones to make this work easily, but you get the idea. You're visiting in someone else's territory. Now, in the ancient world, the other thing that is really important to understand, again, this is something I learned from Schmidt in his translation of Greek, his knowledge of Greek culture in the Greek world and stuff like that, is that the etiquette that is practiced between people who are in your territory as a guest or a traveler, and the expectations that the guest would have of the host and that the host would have of the guest were formal. So you can think of this in India too. When I was in India, there were very I went to a class that was actually talking, it was a woman from Bangladesh who was talking about the etiquette that is expected of a guest from a host and a host from a guest when a traveling monk would go to a new village. So how does the village receive that monk? Or how does a family take in a traveler or something like that? Similarly, if you ever watched if you ever watched Downton Abbey or something like that, there's a whole decorum. There's a whole etiquette that's basically followed when someone comes into the house as a guest. And right, there's tea, there's different ways that you're greeted. There's all of this kind of stuff. So similarly, the basic analogy of the language that's present in ancient Greek astrology is that of house guests, basically, but where the idea of house is more akin to family or tribe or even nation. So a house guest is not like today where we have a very privatized sense of house. It's more like House Stark, House Lannister. It has that feeling of a broader tribal kind of context, or a broader kind of almost nationalistic context. So you're a guest in the home of Mars. That's what Jupiter has been, a guest in the home of Mars for the past year. So when, yes, Stark visiting House Bolton, right? There you go. So you have Jupiter has been a guest in the house of Mars. Now, every guest has needs. Every guest has needs. So what are the needs of Jupiter? Well, Jupiter's needs are for expansion, growth, wisdom, hope, optimism, faith, grandiosity, bigness, maybe some arrogance, right? But you get it. Like, these are the basic needs that Jupiter has. This is what Jupiter desires. Jupiter desires the same things that, in a sense, describe Jupiter's actions or Jupiter's characteristics. You could say Jupiter is characterized by these qualities, or you could say that this is what Jupiter wants. This is what Jupiter wants to express as an omen or signifier in astrology. So when Jupiter goes into your house, comes over to your house, it's like, hey, I'd like faith and knowledge. I'd like to, for there to be a certain amount of, like pomp and officiality and stuff like that. So that's what Jupiter wants. How has it been received as a guest? Well, the expectation is that a host tries to give the guest what it wants. So the host is bound to try to meet the needs of its guest, but it can only do so through what it has available to it. So, for example, in the past year, Jupiter has wanted these things. It's been in the home of Mars. It's not like an incompatible place for Jupiter. Jupiter has no debility in Scorpio. So it's not like it has a hard relationship with Mars. In fact, a lot of bravery and, victory, and you could think of like almost like training for the Olympics, Mars, Jupiter, right? Or something like that. Well, hopefully no steroids, but you get the idea. Jupiter can get along with Mars. There's nothing like antithetical about Jupiter and Mars in when Jupiter's in Scorpio. But this is also a place where, throughout the year, Jupiter is going to be getting its growth, its bigness, its grandiosity, its wisdom, its expansion, its faith, its hope, its inflation, whatever. It's going to be getting it through Mars and what Mars is doing and where Mars is going in the zodiac. So Mars is constantly going to be trying to address the needs of its guest. So all year, in other words, you could also say that you have Jupiter basically behaving in a Mars-like way, or receiving and giving, sort of giving us its gifts because it's receiving whatever it has to give through Mars, through its host. So wisdom comes through confrontation. Wisdom comes through depth and intensity. Wisdom comes through muscle strength and victory. Wisdom comes through, competition and strife. Wisdom comes through aggression. Do you see what I'm saying? So you're looking at how the needs of Jupiter end up getting met by the qualities of Mars, how the host provides. It says, oh, you'd like faith and hope? Well, I can give that to you, but it comes with a knife when I give it to you. Do you know what I mean? Or like a good fist fight or something like that. So for a lot of us, that means that the faith, hope, growth, optimism, expansion, etc., which, let's face it, Jupiter's been called the greater benefic for a long time for good reason. We all like that stuff, right? But we've been getting that stuff because of Mars, because we've been getting it through Mars. So all of that stuff has been coming through a heavier, more intense confrontational quality. What to speak of a more detailed level of analysis, for example, throughout the year, look at where Mars is actually located, because where it is located also tells us something about what it has to give. So, for example, Mars is retrograde all summer long, and people said, this Mars retrograde, wasn't that bad for me? I heard so many people say that. This Mars retrograde wasn't bad. There was a lot of difficult stuff that I had to work through, but a lot of good came out of it. And almost every time I'm like, yeah, that's because Jupiter is in Mars's sign. Do you know what I mean? Because wherever Mars is going in the past year, it has been also providing for Jupiter in its own house. So it's, in a sense, like whatever Jupiter, a lot of the people, in other words, have been like, well, that Mars transit wasn't that bad. And it's like, probably what you're picking up on is the fact that Jupiter is bringing abundance through its connection with Mars this year. So that changes, right? That changes quite a bit when, Saturn goes into Aries. You know what I mean? Because then Saturn's in its fall in Aries, and then Mars ruled stuff and Mars transits are feeding back or in relationship to Saturn. And so Saturn, a house guest in Mars, Mars keeps trying to answer the needs of Saturn. So you think that's one of the reasons why Saturn is in its fall in Aries. It's a very much more conflicted relationship between Mars and Saturn. So at any rate, you get the point. But this is how to think about these things so that you can begin to use this when you study transits in general. But for Sagittarius, Jupiter entering Sagittarius, the reason that this is such a big deal and so important and exciting is because now Jupiter is going back to its home sign, one of two home signs. First of all, when a planet goes back to its home sign, it's like Ned Stark returning to the North. It's like, I'm in Winterfell. I got my people. I've got my stuff. You're in your warm, cozy place. You can really meet your own needs, and there's no one else that you're relying upon as a guest. And let's face it, traveling is difficult. Being in somebody else's home and being a guest is uncomfortable, even if you have a great guest. Most of the time, we feel the most comfortable when we're back in our own home. So similarly, the planets are very comfortable in their own signs for this reason. They can address their own needs. It's the easiest thing because they're the guest and the host at once, So Jupiter entering Sagittarius, in other words, is more able to meet its need for expansion, growth, faith, hope, optimism, joy, good fortune, good luck, grandiosity, bigness, inflation. It's just easier for it to just be that way and to get it done. It's not relying on Mars to go get it done for it anymore. It doesn't have to sort of, cross with a Mars-like theme. For example, over the summer, even though, Mars is retrograde, so the host, that's having a little bit of a hard time addressing what Jupiter needs or wants. Jupiter wants, let's say, expansion. And, So let's say Jupiter needs growth and expansion, and Mars is trying to bring it from Aquarius while it's retrograde. That's a little tough. And then let's say Mars is retrograde in Aquarius, which is a square to Scorpio. And Jupiter's in the overpowering, or what we call the superior square position to Mars and Scorpio. So it's really saying, look, I need to grow. I need to grow right now. And Mars is like, oh man, I'm really struggling. I'm retrograde right now. Like I don't have my full volitional strength and power to like get the job done for you. Okay. And they're in a square with one another, which is challenging. Okay. So again, through, the difficulty, the arduousness of that square, something might come back to Jupiter that's good or positive, but it happens through a more pressuring condition. That's not there when Jupiter's in Sagittarius. Jupiter might make aspects to other things and other planets in the sky or whatever, but in terms of meeting its own needs, no problem. It's it's like it's in its own sign. It's a lot easier. So the other thing is that this is one of the reasons why I very strongly urge people to not think about the outer planets in terms of sign rulerships. I don't want to be like some kind of I don't want to act like an authoritarian about it, but people who use sign rulerships with modern planets don't understand how rulerships work in the traditional sense. They don't understand how they're used in order to delineate topics most of the time. It's not that there aren't interesting archetypal associations between Pluto and Scorpio or between Neptune and Pisces or whatever, but archetypal association is not the same thing as rulership. And the entire cosmology of ancient astrology that was built in much the same way that the I Ching is a kind of a complete cosmological model as well as a divinatory system. The cosmological model of the early Greeks it's sort of complete unto itself. It's not that things can't be added on. It's not that the outer planets don't have tons of interesting merit, but to try and shoehorn the outer planets into that scheme, into the beautiful model of ancient astrology before you've even begun to understand how delineation was done, and it's just a mistake. And it's like people could sometimes be like, for example, an analogy might be, people are like, well, I've been using, outer planetary rulerships for a long time to great effect. It's like, yeah, you can, people can play a musical instrument like a grand piano, and having taught themselves, they can play it to great effect. But that doesn't mean that they're playing it in the same way that Bach or Mozart learned to play. Do you know what I'm saying? So you can have a whole debate as to whether or not a person should or would want to go back and learn it the way that it's been learned. But the important thing is, if someone were to take the way that they were playing on a piano, not having been classically trained, and then suggest that this is the formal way of doing it, is just deceptive. It's a lie. And so the important thing is to just understand that the association between outer planets and signs can be totally valid, but usually it's far more diverse than people are aware of, and you don't have to try to shoehorn rulership concepts in before you've understood the entire vast web of dignities and what they really meant and what they were really meant to do. So anyways, that's my soapbox about that. If people can feel free to disagree with me. I feel very strongly about it. But all of that is also just to say that the reason that Jupiter in Sagittarius is so important is because there are two signs that Jupiter traditionally rules: Pisces, not Neptune, and Sagittarius. Now, again, no offense to anybody who finds that there's archetypal associations between Neptune and Pisces. I think you can make a great case that there are archetypal associations with the outer planets and lots of signs if you start thinking a little bit more carefully. But that aside, traditionally there were two forms of rulership that every planet except for the sun and the moon had: one masculine and one feminine. The masculine sign of all of the planets, save one exception that it's too sort of esoteric and deep to get into right now, but the masculine signs in general, which were home to the diurnal sect of planets, so Leo, the sun; Aquarius, which is Saturn's sign; Sagittarius, which is Jupiter's sign. Those are the diurnal planets, the diurnal sect of planets, plus Mercury in Gemini, which is Mercury's masculine home. There are no exaltation lords in those signs. Exaltation lords were connected to the moon and the feminine, and exaltation lords were assigned to the feminine signs: Taurus, Pisces, Cancer, Capricorn, etc. Now, there's an exception to this with Libra and Aries, and it's too complex to get into right now. But the basic idea is that when Jupiter is in Sagittarius, it is at its most independent. The masculine signs, like Yang in Taoism and in the I Ching, the masculine signs are thought of as the most autonomous, most able to stand on their own. And so they're most able to affect their own significations without sort of cooperative participatory dynamic with an exaltation lord, another oikodespotes, that participates in the rulership of the sign. You can see this just very clearly in terms of the way the feminine was thought of as more relational, more participatory, more cooperative, more dependent, all yin-based things. The masculine signs like Sagittarius, no cooperative ruler, it's on its own. And that the basic reason for that making a difference right now is that when Jupiter is in Sagittarius, it's also at its most strong and independent. So there's also volition that's associated with the masculine in ancient astrology. The concept of spirit, or the sun, the diurnal sect, of the spirit houses at the top half of the chart, all where the diurnal joys take place. All of these intricate components of the ancient astrological system, but they all point to the masculine signs where there's only one ruler, for example, as also being more related to this broad concept of spirit. And spirit spirit can be thought of as volitional, where there's more of a sense of conscious intentionality and action, and in a sense, in a certain way, conscious outcome or conscious reaction. Whereas the feminine signs in their cooperative rulership with an exaltation lord and their connection to exaltation and depression, which is a concept based on the moon, has more to do with the participating role that circumstance, unconsciousness, karma, you could think of it as even karma from past lives, that there are many more factors that sort of combine and participate together in the feminine signs than there are in the masculine. It's just a little bit more like, for better or worse, it has more of that feeling of volition and intentionality to it in a masculine sign. Now, there's bad things that are not necessarily great about that either. So that gets into a deeper philosophical conversation. But Jupiter in Sagittarius, you could think of as just very volitional, independent, strong, willful, not so dependent upon circumstantial reality as much as it is trying to intend and will its own choices. Another thing that's important to understand about fire signs naturally are hot and dry in this sort of qualitative sense. And so the hotness and dryness of Jupiter in a fire sign also has this effect of basically where there is more dryness, there's more separativeness. There's more sort of individuality. So the fire signs being individualistic are associated with what heat does, which is dries things out. And when things dry out, they get more separative and hardened. So if you think about what happens when you cook, a clay pot that you've made or something like that, it becomes hardened and more concrete, less able to be penetrated, mushed, squished, like that. So fire does the same thing. And in that regard, again, it has more of kind of spirit of things becoming more concretized and more independent. So another thing that goes along with fire is, of course, the hotness. And the hotness is very subtle in ancient astrology. So heat is thought of as closest to the heat, and fire is sort of closest to the ethereal realm. And so it's individualistic, but it's also in a sense visionary. It's very imaginative potentially, or it has a great sense of kind of intuitive quality, or it sort of is anticipating things right before they happen in a almost non-human, non-physical kind of way. There's a quality of a visionary quality that, when accompanied with the dry quality, sort of says, I want to will the world into the shape, I want it to conform to my will. I want to shape the world and conform it to my will. That's also very strong in a fire sign. So when Jupiter is in its home sign and it has all of these qualities, it's also much more masculine, and it has much more sort of independence and autonomy, and it can really address its own needs. Now, all of that can be really great. Like that could be awesome, right? In terms of what we like about Jupiter: faith, growth, hope, joy, abundance. Okay, well, that sounds really good. First of all, let's just acknowledge that it's not I think a lot of the times Sean Nygaard pointed out in a talk that he recently did at Nightlight, he was talking about Jupiter and saying, like, we're so quick to be like, okay, Jupiter's bigness, grandness, and faith, but watch out for exaggeration and arrogance, and like, okay, that's it. He's a very patient presenter and really gets deep into it. We learned a lot about Jupiter recently that's so much bigger than just here's the plus, here's the minus. Let's say a few things about Jupiter to draw it out a little bit more. I'll take notes from my friend Sean. Jupiter, this comes from Richard Tarnas's Cosmos and Psyche. Jupiter, the principle of expansion, magnitude, growth, elevation, superiority, the capacity and impulse to enlarge and grow, to ascend and progress, to improve and magnify, to incorporate that which is external, to make greater wholes, to inflate, to experience success, honor, advancement, plenitude, abundance, prodigality, excess, surfeit, the capacity or inclination for magnanimity, optimism, enthusiasm, exuberance, joy, joviality, liberality, breadth of experience, philosophical and cultural aspiration, comprehensiveness and largeness of vision, pride, arrogance, aggrandizement, extravagance, fecundity, fortune, and providence. Zeus, the king of the Olympian gods. Now, one of the things that people are always baffled about with Jupiter has to do with one of the last things that Tarnas said, which is this word providence. So what is providence, or what does it mean when something is providential? A simple way of understanding it that I've heard one of my teachers explain from within the Bhakti Yoga tradition goes like this. Sometimes in life you do X, Y, or Z, and you're thinking, you might get, W as a result. Okay, so you're like, kind of a reasonable expectation for the kind of effort you put in. But then suddenly, despite, this basic effort that you put in, you get like, 4 times W. You get so much more than what you were expecting. And in some ways, in what anyone would expect from the kind of effort that you put in. That's providence. Similarly, you did something that was a little bit bad. You weren't expecting to get much of a bad reaction. Like you just made one offhand foot in your mouth comment that wasn't a big deal. It does not show your true character because you're really a pretty nice person, but you just made one kind of, stupid comment and you got a really intensely big, sort of bad reaction. Also providence. Both are the territory of Jupiter. Why? Because Jupiter is bigness, and Jupiter in connection to bigness is providence. Providence is often understood not just as good things that happen to you, like providential events are often we associate with just like, oh, good things that have happened to me that were kind of unexpected. That's part of it, but it's more about the largeness of a result in proportion to the actions associated with it, the largeness of an outcome, and it doesn't quite seem to fit with the actions that went with it, the bigness of a result. So a lot of times people are baffled when Jupiter brings up things like death in the family. It enters your 4th house. You're like, yeah, I'm probably going to get a new home in the next year, right? But instead, like 3 family members die, and they die unexpectedly. People are like, oh, Jupiter? Like, you totally betrayed me. Like, what? Part of this has to do with the fact that Jupiter is providential. Jupiter brings events that are big in proportion to what we are expecting, for better or worse. And a lot of the better or worse also depends on other planets and houses, aspects that the Jupiter is making in your chart, and things like that. So I can't tell you how many times Jupiter in the 4th house will bring sort of like a slew of karmic reckonings within a person's home or family that sometimes feel sort of like out of whack, like this, sort of out of proportion to what one is expecting, or what anyone's actions seem to have been, or whatever. So Jupiter is like that. Jupiter is providential in the sense of bringing big results, and sometimes good, and sometimes not so good. This is also one of the things that inspires faith in us. In the ancient world, whether you were a polytheistic, Greek sort of pagan, or you were, a monotheist or whatever, one thing that has been commonly believed by people who believe in the gods or God on any level is that the ultimate management or ultimate control of outcomes is in the hands of something bigger than ourselves. We participate, but that ultimately the outcomes are bigger than us. Okay, so in other words, there's a cosmic judge and jury, who deliberates, who makes mandates, or who there's the decrees of fate and destiny, in other words. And there are also providential interactions in our life that, when we look at them carefully and when we really consider them, a huge amount of people on this planet will easily admit or recognize the hand of providence, meaning that something has entered in and a result has come that was very much unexpected, very out of proportion with what was expected or intended. And for those of us who believe in that, what comes with that is trust, faith, and hope. Because even when something is unexpectedly bad, the faithful person in many different traditions will say, it must be the will of the gods. And I trust that the will of the gods is good. I trust that it is, maybe not in all cultures the gods are necessarily, pristine characters, but there's some inherent sense of trust or faith in cosmic order and in the way that events play out, the meaningfulness of them, or the reason for their happening in some larger picture that sometimes we're conscious of. And so providence is also intimately related to trust, faith, and hope. So that's one of the most important things is to remember that for ancient, in ancient times, you could say that the belief that something larger is guiding your life in the context of ancient astrology was very, very basic. So you have almost all of the ancient source texts have some way of sort of tipping their hat and bowing to forces greater than ourselves. That is something that's very difficult for us in the modern era because we believe that we are self-determined. For example, in China today, as I understand it, people will still their last name will still come before their first name, which shows the sense of prioritizing that thing that's greater than them, the family that they belong to or whatever. And the first name, the more individual sense, comes second. Well, that's reversed in the West, isn't it? So not to say one is better than the other necessarily, but certainly in the West, we tend to prize, and even in ancient Greece compared to the East, there was slightly more of an emphasis on individuality. But the point is that today it's very hard for us to imagine that we are in some sense subservient to or should be submissive to higher forces or powers. Almost all of our spiritual paradigms are all about personal empowerment, personal choice, create your own destiny. It's like, and there's nothing wrong with that, especially if we don't believe that our choices matter, or if we feel disenfranchised, or people are out voting today. A lot of them have been told like you shouldn't vote. Like so personal empowerment does matter. But I just watched this movie Generation Wealth. It was a really good documentary about the way, and one of the things that was said by Chris Hedges, who's kind of a famous author. In the film, he was interviewed, and he said, great empires before they collapse usually have problems with great decadence and wealth. And it's sort of a look at the obsession with wealth and self-determination and fame and personal greatness and consumerism and the way that those things have gone together in our culture right now. So interestingly, one of the things that Jupiter and Sagittarius can bring is, yes, inflation, grandiosity, in a sense that everything is about me. So it can be very narcissistic. But on the other hand, Jupiter brings providence. Jupiter brings events that restore our sense of there being a higher authority. What is Zeus, the original name for the planet Jupiter before the Roman names came in? Zeus. What was Zeus's role? He's the grand commander of the cosmic pantheon, in a sense, the chief. So there's a sense of hubris that comes with Zeus, but also often there are the kinds of falls that happen that are providential, meaning that they teach lessons because they often are they're not what you plan or intend, or again, they're outside the range of normal expectations that you have. So if someone's trying to get away with something, they may get handed a much heavier loss, heavier and weightier and out of proportion to what they're expecting. And people will be like, isn't that Saturn? But no. And the reason that it's not is because Jupiter, also called Guru in Indian astrology, the word guru, one of the things that guru means is heavy. And Zeus is also a heavy planet. It's not, Saturn doesn't have the market cornered on being heavy. A lot of people think like, oh, Saturn is a lead, so it's the heavy one. But no, Jupiter is also very heavy in the sense that when things come that are big in our life, especially when they're corrective and have a moral kind of message to send to us, kind of taking our ego down a notch. And they have that sense of being out of proportion with what our ego feels is fair or expected from something that was maybe a little bit naughty or something like that. It's heavy. It's a heavy feeling, but it restores our sense of being small in proportion to something that is big. And that's Jupiter's mercy and Jupiter's blessings for us when our egos get too big. But it will deliver out of proportion results to what you're expecting. On the other hand, sometimes you're working hard and you're not expecting much. You're being, you're trying to be a humble human being, which I think, most of us are, I think, trying to be. Like people who are interested in astrology and spiritual life and stuff like that would probably all appreciate the attempt to be humble. Of course, humility is not a contest where you get a prize or anything, but you know what I'm saying. When we try to be humble and suddenly that auspicious things start happening around us. And that's also Jupiter, where Jupiter sort of rewards good faith. So these kinds of things come through with Jupiter. Jupiter is the lawgiver, and Jupiter is not the law upholder, and it is associated with justice and truth, not just, it's a party, everything's going to get big and fat like Santa Claus, or we're just going to roll around like, sort of high on life, or it has that kind of joviality to it. But Jupiter isn't just some like, thundering god, like, taking big, quaffs of ale or whatever. It's like, it has that side to it. Certainly in the sign of the Centaur, there can be just partying and, again, the ego can get pretty big with Jupiter and Sagittarius. But you also think about this sign of Sagittarius that's connected to the ability to move forward in spiritual life, that there is such a thing as advancement in spiritual life. It's another thing that sometimes we come to hate or despise in spiritual culture. We say, there's no such thing as advancement. Advancement is like a narcissistic or egotistical concept. You shouldn't want or desire advancement. You know what I mean? Like that's so proud, or that's so vain, or whatever. True, we shouldn't be running around thinking, I'm just trying to get to level 10 here in life, and then, then I'll be set, whatever the level 10 might be, spiritually or intellectually or in your business or whatever. Like, okay, so fine, we shouldn't want to get to level 10. It can really become a vain enterprise. But that doesn't mean that there still aren't hierarchical levels of realization, attainment, or knowledge, or that there isn't such a thing as becoming a truly more compassionate human being. We're not all born equally compassionate. You know what I mean? Like maybe our innate spiritual nature, we're all divine already. We're all perfect, or what have you. But in this material world, there is such a thing as actually becoming a better person than you are right now, knowing more than you actually know right now, or getting better at something. Sometimes it feels to me, just talking to lots of people and seeing conversations, sort of watching, it feels like we're offended at the idea that anyone should be naturally better at anything than anyone else, or we're offended at the idea that someone should advance unless everyone advances. And I think that this stems in some ways, understandably, from people being held back from equal opportunities. That's a hugely important thing, right? There's a big difference when we try to do away with the idea that any advancement whatsoever is evil or bad. Jupiter will bring back some of the thrill and joy and reality of actually taking some positive growth steps that are like measurable and tangible, and that not everybody else is doing. That's going to look different for each of us individually. But in other words, it's possible to actually grow, to have marked, again, measurable sort of marked steps that one is taking toward growth. The difference between Jupiter and Saturn, you could say, with regard to like marked growth, is that usually Saturn is the one who's like, okay, I know exactly what next step I need to take, and I'm going to take that now. And there I've taken that step, and now I've measured it, and see, there I've gone. And it's like Saturn has this like really methodical. At Jupiter, we're often really surprised by growth. It's not such an intentional thing. Again, it's often like you're plodding along and you aren't expecting to get the result that you get. It kind of comes in that providential manner. So anyway, you can see some other things. Let's just go through a list here. Pros and cons, cons and their opposites. Inflated ideas not checked by careful study or research. That's got to be careful of that. Jupiter in Sagittarius can be like that, where your enthusiasm leads, but it's not necessarily well researched. But on the other hand, faith sometimes needs to just usurp the need to have everything like well researched. I'll give you a very simple example. Sometimes in ancient astrology, this is a field that I'm really interested in, I've studied a lot in the past 3-4 years. in ancient astrology, like in academics, people will be careful about making any kind of speculative, experimental suggestions or ideas, or putting something out there that's a creative theory, because they're like, well, I have not found it yet within the Hellenistic source text of Paulus or Manilius. I have not yet found it in Rhetorius or whatever, like that. And this happens like in academics as well. People aren't willing to take risks, go out on a limb, make a leap of faith, because they don't feel as though they're protecting their egos. They want to protect the feeling of being in control and of being the master. And if they take a risk and it proves that they were wrong, then I might not be the master anymore. So sometimes sometimes, in other words, the opposite of not being carefully researched and making big statements with false confidence and, oh, this is the way that it is, and you haven't even researched it, which could also be bad. The opposite is true. Sometimes we need to take leaps of faith and put things out there and play with them in a humble spirit, just because that's a part of how creativity and new life takes place. So that tension can be pronounced. In enthusiasm that takes over critical thinking. For example, you get a plan, a vision. You're so excited about it. You want to just run forward with it. And someone says, wait, what if we just planned this out over the course of like a year and did it slowly? And you're like, no. See, then you'll kill my spirit of enthusiasm. Well, why? Can't you maintain enthusiasm in the details? Can't you maintain enthusiasm being a little bit more careful and thoughtful? In other words, we sometimes suffer under the illusion that enthusiasm is something you have to spend immediately or else it wasn't real. When enthusiasm comes, we should be more like, careful, attentive lovers. When the enthusiasm comes, like, how can we stoke this fire and make it last a long time rather than just, go right for the climax, so to speak. On the other hand, sometimes enthusiasm and hope and actions that happen a little bit more quickly and impulsively are needed, because that's how you get something off the ground. And then you can deal with the details later. But the balance between those things can be a big deal over the next year. Dogmatism or ideological grandiosity, meaning I'm enthusiastic, I have these faith statements, I believe in them, they're true, etc., like that, and it gets inflated mostly because of one's attitude, and just being too hyper confident and certain of oneself. But on the other hand, sometimes people say, if you believe anything with certainty, you must be evil, right? So in other words, I can't tell you how many times I've had this conversation on my YouTube channel, my Facebook feeds, and emails with people, whatever. I will say openly something about how I believe in God. And someone will be like, well, surely you must believe that it's equally valid for someone to not believe in God, right? This is just a very simple example. And I'll always say, I support people's right to believe whatever they want to, but that does not mean that I have to believe that it is equally valid that God does not exist, right? I believe, so I'm just being honest for a second, I believe that I should be able to sit down with an atheist friend and be like, you don't believe that God exists, which means that you believe that what I believe about God is wrong. And I believe that God exists, which means that I believe that your claim that God doesn't exist is wrong. We can think that our ideas are wrong and still love each other. So I don't have to be like, hey, in order for us to get along, both of our ideas have to be right. So having principles is very important, whether they're philosophical or ethical or spiritual or whatever. You can believe a principle. And in Jupiter and Sagittarius, we can reclaim the importance of principles and the way that principles may contradict one another. There may not be room for both of them to be real or true, essentially, at the same time. But that doesn't mean that we can't love and respect one another. Now, of course, some people will, claim in a logic that's very different from my own that like all of it can be true at once. And I can't go there. I believe that a competition of views and beliefs is okay. It's healthy. and that it's important. We have free speech for this reason. We should have competing ideals and values and beliefs. They can't, I don't think they should or have to be all true at the same time. But we don't always have to be threatened when our ideas are different from one another either. So Jupiter in Sagittarius there's a fine line also between dogmatism, where you're like, my idea is true and right, and that makes you an invalid human being, and then saying like, my principles are different from yours. I don't believe yours are true, or I don't agree with them, but I still have compassion and love and respect for you as a dignified human being. So Jupiter in Sagittarius also straddles the line between those kinds of issues. The other thing is that overpowering persuasion versus being receptive to conversion. There is an incredible thrill with Jupiter and Sagittarius of allowing someone else's passion and enthusiasm and beliefs to like come into us, right? But it can very easily turn into competition of ideas, beliefs, opinions, even something as simple like, where should we go tonight? Jupiter and Sagittarius is like, for a ride, let's go, like that. And what's very common when it's a fire sign, very individualistic, very willful, is for the other person to be like, for a slow walk, how about that? And then people would be like, oh no, that's Saturn. Like, that's Saturn. Saturn's the one who doesn't want to go for a ride. No. That's just Jupiter competing with Jupiter. It's a conviction, fiery sense of like, this is what will take us to the next horizon. It's the slow walk under the autumnal leaves tonight, you asshole. And the other person is like, no, a ride right now with the sunroof down in the cold while listening to Miley Cyrus is what's going to bring us happiness. So it's like competition of wills can become really strong and intense, and it's people passionate about what they believe will bring good things, or what they believe will bring abundance or joy or happiness. The whole thing shifts when we allow ourselves to be taken by someone else's vision, enthusiasm, charisma, just saying, I kind of wanted to go for a slow walk, but I'm going to just say screw it and go do your crazy vision. Amazing joy and fun can start to come when, rather than getting into the space of Jupiter and Sagittarius where we compete with our vision and our big ideas and what we really want and everything, and just immediately be like, nope, I'm throwing that out. I'm going with that person. That sounds really fun and interesting. Let's go do that. Even if I don't believe it and even if it's not what I want to do, they're going to convert me and I'm going to have fun. That's what's going to happen. So your certainty, your faith, your confidence, your joy and enthusiasm, remember, in Sagittarius, it's flexible. You can turn on a dime and be converted to someone else's joyride, right? And that can bypass so many of the uncomfortable, petty conflicts that we tend to get into about, Miley Cyrus joyrides versus like your walk down the street. And, so you get what I'm saying, though. Allow yourself to be open to being converted by someone else's enthusiasm. Now, there's going to be situations where that's not called for. Someone is telling you like, hey, let's just drink this dish soap. Like, sounds like a great idea. Let's just chug this Dove, or whatever the case might be. You're going to be like, no, it's a really bad idea. And you have to stand your ground, and convicted, battles of principles may have to take place. But just remember, be open to conversion, because the ability to switch and be receptive to someone else's charisma can take you on really, like, it can build bigger wholes and create unity and make for really exciting experiences. So, okay. Finally, sometimes, again, remember that the innate sense that we all have with our first name, last name is, I rule the ship. I'm the driver. I'm the governor. Like, it's me. And I'm the one driving this cyber Ferrari. And throughout the next year, remember that when you surrender to something bigger than yourself, whatever that might be, amazing things can come when Jupiter's in Sagittarius. On the other hand, another thing that's an amazing empowerment of your personal creative volition and participation in divine creation is to ask, how can I be a servant of something higher? How can you use me in all that I love and that is essential to who I am? And asking the universe, asking God, how can you use me in a way that I will be excited about, because you're using my natural talents and gifts, and also serves your larger plan? We think we can't have our cake and eat it too. But the truth is that spiritual life, in a sense, is about having our cake and eating it too, because it's essentially trusting that when you surrender your will to the divine, that if you believe in a benevolent divine universe or a higher power or powers, and you say to yourself, I believe that the higher intelligence has my best interests in mind and also has a vision of harmony and beauty for the whole. And if I just ask, put me in service to that, then I'm inherently trusting that the divine will do so in a way that also considers me and considers my joy and my gifts and who I really am. So we have to trust that, because if we're like, well, I just grew up with a nasty Catholic God who was like just really punitive and harsh, and like, so I just don't believe in anything but me and my will. Do you know what I mean? We need to like revitalize our connection to spirit and to something bigger that moves in us and through us, that's trustworthy and good, and that can take us places that will utilize who we really are and what our gifts are. And that we don't have to get into some kind of power struggle with the universe being like, no, it's me and I've got to do it. And we're not alone in that regard. You know what I mean? It's a very isolating view. So Jupiter and Sagittarius can also connect us to this sense of like, my gifts, what's beautiful and unique about me, and what will bring me deeply meaningful happiness can also be found when I trust and surrender and ask for guidance from someone or something bigger than myself, whether that's finding a teacher, a mentor, a path, just asking for guidance in your daily prayer life, trying to be more intentional about creating a spiritual platform in your everyday life, and trusting that doing those things will start bringing higher guidance in, and that it will be good for you. Like a good time to do it with Jupiter and Sagittarius. So, all right. Finally, I'm going to read one thing from James Hillman to close. James Hillman had a great way of talking about the puer, which is the sort of eternal youth, and related to this idea of that which is immortal and sort of forever young in all of us, very connected to Jupiter. The greatest exemplary of pothos in antiquity was Alexander the Great. He is said to have himself invented the phrase seized by pothos to account for his indescribable longing for something beyond, a longing that carried him beyond all borders in a horizontal conquest of space, a true spaceman of ancient times. Alexander had merely to sit upon a riverbank or before his tent and look into the distance when he would be seized by pothos and urged to go farther. Space and distance became the visual image that released his yearning. Okay, and then a little bit later in the same section, he says, Pothos is the blue romantic flower of love that idealizes and drives our wanderings. Or as the Romantics put it, we are defined not by what we are or what we do, but by what we long for. Tell me for what you yearn, and I shall tell you who you are. We are what we reach for, the idealized image that drives our wandering. Pothos, as the wider factor in Eros, drives the sailor-wanderer to quest for what cannot be fulfilled and what must be impossible. It is the source of impossible love, producing the Tristan complex that refuses Himeros and Anteros in order to maintain the transcendence of Pothos. This side of Eros makes possible living in the world as a scene of impossible mythical action, mythologizing life. This component of Eros is the factor, or the divine figure, within all our senseless individuation adventures. The phallic foolishness that sends us chasing, the mind's mad wanderings after impossibilities, our forever being at sea, and the fictive goals we must set ourselves, all so that we may go on loving. So I chose that because in both beautiful readings from Hillman, we have an image of ourselves as romantic figures searching for some impossible conquest. Whether it's becoming myself. I remember when I was 15, I just want to be me. That was like 90s alternative music, and the phrase, the word like society, and then the phrase, I just want to be me. They really stand out in my youth. I really remember them. Similarly, individuation, Jungian individuation. I'm becoming my highest self, right? Or enlightenment, or a purpose-driven life, or whatever it might be. Even, but within all of them, there is, in a sense, an archetype that's at work in all of us that's necessary on some levels for our psychic health, and that is the most basic reality of all spiritual paradigms, you could say, which is that we yearn for something that eludes us, that feels impossible in this world. We reach out from some sense of not being fulfilled, of having desires that are not thirsts or desires that are not quenched. And we move through life with yearning for satisfaction. And it's a sort of impossibility that mythologizes and brings deep meaning to our life, that allows us to go on loving and living in the way that we do with such bigness of heart. And so I love that passage, because behind all of it, regardless of where you stand or what you believe or don't believe, Jupiter in Sagittarius year is a year where you can come back to that place of being in love with the impossibility of your situation, and daring to sort of grab it, a little carpe diem energy, and just say, okay, like I need to live more deeply into the space of the sort of impossibility of my situation. I need to embrace that more, live from faith and hope, adventure. These things come through so strongly, and it's so important because in the broadest sense, this renews our faith in why we're here, and it can connect us to something higher. Again, if we think that the thing that we're reaching for beyond the horizon ultimately is deeper and ever more endlessly intimate levels of love with the divine whole of which we are a part, then everything that we do, everything can be seen as something moving in service to that love and that calling. So I hope that this has been interesting for everybody. We're at 1 hour and 15 minutes. I'll probably do maybe one other talk on Jupiter in Sagittarius, but I was able to cover a lot of ground today, so I feel pretty good about this. I hope that you are all in a good space. The new moon's coming through, and that Jupiter lifts you up and reminds you that you're here to have an adventure and to renew your commitment and faith to that adventure. Okay, everyone, you have a great day today. Take care. Bye.